Hey, little buddies, it's Uncle Rick from the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club. Today's podcast comes from a book by Theodore Roosevelt. I expect you've heard that name before. And the book is Stories of the Great West. Today I'm reading a chapter entitled Sheriff's Work on a Ranch. In our own immediate locality, we've had more difficulty with white desperados than with the redskins. At times, there's been a good deal of cattle killing and horse stealing, and occasionally a murder or two. But as regards the last, a man has very little more to fear in the West than in the East, in spite of all the lawless acts one reads about. Undoubtedly, a long-standing quarrel sometimes ends in a shooting match, and, of course, savage affrays occasionally take place in the barrooms, in which, be it remarked, that, inasmuch as the men are generally drunk, and furthermore, as the revolver is at best a rather inaccurate weapon, outsiders are nearly as apt to get hurt as are the participants. But if a man minds his own business and does not go into bar rooms, gambling saloons, and the like, he need have no fear of being molested, while a revolver is a mere foolish encumbrance for any but a thorough expert, and need never be carried. Against horse thieves, cattle thieves, claim jumpers, and the like, however, every ranchman has to be on his guard, and armed collisions with these gentry are sometimes inevitable. The fact of such scoundrels being able to ply their trade with impunity for any length of time can only be understood if the absolute wildness of our land is taken into account. The country is still unsurveyed and unmapped. The course of the river itself, as put down on the various government and railroad maps, is very much a mere piece of guesswork, its bed being in many parts, as by my ranch, 10 or 15 miles or more away from where these maps make it. White hunters came into the land by 1880, but the actual settlement only began in 1882, when the first cattlemen drove in their herds, all of northern stock, the Texans not passing north of the country around the headwaters of the river until the following year. While until 1885, the territory through which it ran for the final 150 miles before entering the Big Missouri remained as little known as ever. Some of us had always been anxious to run down the river in a boat during the time of the spring floods, as we thought we might get good duck and goose shooting, and also kill some beaver, while the trip would, in addition, have all the charm of an exploring expedition. Twice, so far as we knew, the feat had been performed, both times by hunters, and in one instance with very good luck in shooting and trapping. A third attempt, by two men on a raft, made the spring preceding that on which we made ours, had been less successful, for when a score or so of miles below our ranch, a bear killed one of the two adventurers, and the survivor returned. We could only go down during a freshet, for the Little Missouri, like most plains rivers, is usually either a dwindling streamlet, a mere slender thread of sluggish water, or else a boiling, muddy torrent running over a bed of shifting quicksand that neither man nor beast can cross. It rises and falls with extraordinary suddenness and intensity, an instance of which has just occurred as this very page is being written. Last evening, when the moon rose, from the ranch veranda we could see the riverbed almost dry, the stream having shrunk under the drought till it was little but a string of shallow pools, with between them a trickle of water that was not ankle deep, and hardly wet the fetlocks of the saddle-band when driven across it. Yet at daybreak this morning, without any rain having fallen near us, but doubtless in consequence of some heavy cloudburst near its head, the swift, swollen current was foaming brim-high between the banks, and even the fords were swimming deep for the horses. Accordingly, we had planned to run down the river sometime toward the end of April, taking advantage of a rise, but an accident made us start 3 or 4 weeks sooner than we had intended. In 1886, the ice went out of the upper river very early, during the first part of February, but it at times almost froze over again. The bottom ice did not break up, and a huge gorge, scores of miles in length, formed in and above the bend known as the Oxbow, a long distance upstream from my ranch. About the middle of March, this great oxbow jam came down past us. It moved slowly, its front forming a high, crumbling wall, and creaming over like an immense breaker on the seashore. We could hear the dull roaring and crunching as it plowed down the riverbed long before it came in sight round the bend above us. The ice kept piling and tossing up in the middle, and not only heaped itself above the level of the banks, but also in many places spread out on each side beyond them, grinding against the cottonwood trees in front of the ranch veranda, and at one moment bidding fair to overwhelm the house itself. It did not, however, but move slowly down past us with that look of vast, resistless, relentless force that any great body of moving ice, as a glacier or an iceberg, always conveys to the beholder. The heaviest pressure from the water that was backed up behind, being of course always in the middle, this part kept breaking away, and finally was pushed on clear through, leaving the river so changed that it could hardly be known. On each bank, and for a couple of 100 feet out from it into the stream, was a solid mass of ice, edging the river along most of its length, at least as far as its course lay through lands we knew. And in the narrow channel between the sheer ice walls, the water ran like a mill race. At night, the snowy, glittering masses, tossed up and heaped into fantastic forms, shone like crystal in the moonlight. But they soon lost their beauty, becoming fouled and blackened, and at the same time melted and settled down until it was possible to clamber out across the slippery hummocks. We had brought out a clinker-built boat especially to ferry ourselves over the river when it was high, and we were keeping our ponies on the opposite side where there was a good range shut in by some very broken country that we knew they would not be apt to cross. This boat had already proven very useful, and now came in handier than ever, as without it we could take no care of our horses. We kept it on the bank tied to a tree, and every day would carry it or slide it across the hither ice bank, usually with not a little tumbling and scrambling on our part, lower it gently into the swift current, pull it across to the ice on the farther bank, and then drag it over that, repeating the operation when we came back. One day we crossed and walked off about 10 miles to a tract of wild and rugged country, cleft in every direction by ravines and cedar canyons, in the deepest of which we had left 4 deer hanging a fortnight before, as game thus hung up in cold weather keeps indefinitely. The walking was very bad, especially over the clay buttes, for the sun at midday had enough strength to thaw out the soil to the depth of a few inches only, and accordingly the steep hillsides were covered by a crust of slippery mud, with the frozen ground underneath. It was hard to keep one's footing, and to avoid falling while balancing along the knife-edge-like ridge crest, or while clinging to the stunted sagebrush as we went down into the valleys. The deer had been hung in a thicket of dwarf cedars, but when we reached the place we found nothing save scattered pieces of their carcasses, and the soft mud was tramped all over with round, deeply marked footprints, some of them but a few hours old, showing that the plunderers of our cache were a pair of cougars, mountain lions as they are called by Westerners, that had evidently been at work for some time and had eaten almost every scrap of flesh. One of the deer had been carried for some distance to the other side of a deep, narrow, chasm-like gully, across which the cougar must have leaped with the carcass in its mouth. We followed the fresh trail of the cougars for some time, as it was well marked, especially in the snow still remaining in the bottoms of the deeper ravines. Finally it led into a tangle of rocky hills riven by dark, cedar-clad gorges, in which we lost it, and we retraced our steps, intending to return on the morrow with a good tracking hound. But we never carried out our intentions, for next morning one of my men who was out before breakfast came back to the house with the startling news that our boat was gone, stolen, for he brought with him the end of the rope with which it had been tied, evidently cut off with a sharp knife, and also a red woolen mitten with a leather palm which he had picked up on the ice. We had no doubt as to who had stolen it, for whoever had done so had certainly gone down the river in it, and the only other thing in the shape of a boat on the Little Missouri was a small, flat-bottomed scow in the possession of 3 hard characters who lived in a shack or hut some 20 miles above us, and whom we had shrewdly suspected for some time of wishing to get out of the country, as certain of the cattlemen had begun openly to threaten to lynch them. They belonged to a class that always holds sway during the raw youth of a frontier community, and the putting down of which is the first step toward decent government. Dakota, west of the Missouri, has been settled very recently, and every town within it has seen strange antics performed during the past 6 or 7 years. Medora, in particular, has had more than its full share of shooting and stabbing affrays, of horse stealing and cattle killing. But the time for such things was passing away, and during the preceding fall the vigilantes, locally known as stranglers, in happy allusion to their summary method of doing justice, had made a clean sweep of the cattle country along the Yellowstone and that part of the Big Missouri around and below its mouth. Be it remarked in passing that while the outcome of their efforts had been in the main wholesome, yet, as is always the case in an extended raid of vigilantes, several of the 60-odd victims had been perfectly innocent men who had been hung or shot in company with the real scoundrels, either through carelessness and misapprehension or on account of some personal spite. The 3 men we suspected had long been accused, justly or unjustly, of being implicated in both cattle killing and in that worst of frontier crimes, horse stealing. It was only by an accident that they had escaped the clutches of the vigilantes the preceding fall. Their leader was a well-built fellow named Finnegan, who had long red hair reaching to his shoulders, and always wore a broad hat and a fringed buckskin shirt. He was rather a hard case, and had been chief actor in a number of shooting scrapes. The other 2 were a half-breed, a stout, muscular man, and an old German whose viciousness was of the weak and shiftless type. We knew that these 3 men were becoming uneasy and were anxious to leave the locality, and we also knew that traveling on horseback in the direction in which they would wish to go was almost impossible, as the swollen, ice-fringed rivers could not be crossed at all, and the stretches of broken ground would form nearly an impassable barrier. So we had little doubt that it was they who had taken our boat, and as they knew there was then no boat left on the river, and as the country along its banks was entirely impracticable for horses, we felt sure they would be confident that there could be no pursuit. Accordingly, we at once set to work in our turn to build a flat-bottomed scow wherein to follow them. Our loss was very annoying, and might prove a serious one if we were long prevented from crossing over to look after the saddle band. But the determining motive in our minds was neither chagrin nor anxiety to recover our property. In any wild country where the power of the law is little felt or heeded, and where everyone has to rely upon himself for protection, men soon get to feel that it is in the highest degree unwise to submit to any wrong without making an immediate and resolute effort to avenge it upon the wrongdoers, at no matter what cost of risk or trouble. To submit tamely and meekly to theft or any other injury is to invite almost certain repetition of the offense, in a place where self-reliant hardihood and the ability to hold one's own under all circumstances rank as the first virtues. 2 of my cowboys, Seawall and Dow, were originally from Maine, and were mighty men of their hands, skilled in woodcraft and the use of the axe, paddle, and rifle. They set to work with a will, as by good luck there were plenty of boards. In 2 or 3 days they had turned out a first-class flat bottom, which was roomy, drew very little water, and was dry as a bone, and though of course not a handicraft, was easily managed enough in going downstream. Into this we packed flour, coffee, and bacon enough to last us a fortnight or so, plenty of warm bedding, and the mess kit, and early one cold March morning slid it into the icy current, took our seats, and shoved off down the river. There could have been no better men for a trip of this kind than my 2 companions, Seawall and Dow. They were tough, hardy, resolute fellows, quick as cats, strong as bears, and able to travel like bull moose. We felt very little uneasiness as to the result of a fight with the men we were after, provided we had anything like a fair show. Moreover, we intended, if possible, to get them at such a disadvantage that there would not be any fight at all. The only risk of any consequence that we ran was that of being ambushed, for the extraordinary formation of the Badlands, with the grounds cut up into gullies, serried walls, and battlemented hilltops, makes it the country of all others for hiding places and ambushes. For several days before we started, the weather had been bitterly cold, as a furious blizzard was blowing. But on the day we left there was a lull, and we hoped a thaw had set in. We all were most warmly and thickly dressed, with woolen socks and underclothes, heavy jackets and trousers, and great fur coats, so that we felt we could bid defiance to the weather. Each carried his rifle, and we had in addition a double-barreled duck gun for waterfowl and beaver. To manage the boat, we had paddles, heavy oars, and long iron-shod poles, seawall steering, while Dow sat in the bow. Altogether, we felt as if we were off on a holiday trip, and set to work to have as good a time as possible. The river twisted in every direction, winding to and fro across the alluvial valley bottom, only to be brought up by the rows of great barren buttes that abounded it on each edge. It had worn away the size of these till they towered up as cliffs of clay, marl, or sandstone. Across their white faces, the seams of coal drew sharp black bands, and they were elsewhere blotched and varied with brown, yellow, purple, and red. This fantastic coloring, together with the jagged irregularity of their crests, channeled by the weather into spires, buttresses, and battlements, as well as their barrenness and the distinctness with which they loomed up through the high, dry air, gave them a look that was a singular mixture of the terrible and the grotesque. The bottoms were covered thickly with leafless cottonwood trees, or else with withered brown grass and stunted, sprawling sage bushes. At times the cliffs rose close to us on either hand, and again the valley would widen into a sinuous oval a mile or two long, bounded on every side, as our eyes could see, by a bluff line without a break, until as we floated down close to its other end, there would suddenly appear in one corner a cleft through which the stream rushed out. As it grew dusk, the shadowy outlines of the buttes lost nothing of their weirdness. The twilight only made their uncouth shapelessness more grim and forbidding. They looked like the crouching figures of great goblin beasts. Then he gives a little verse of a poem. Those two hills on the right crouched like two bulls locked horn in fight, while to the left a tall scalped mountain, the dying sunset kindled through a cleft. The hills like giants at a hunting lay, chin upon hand to see the game at bay. Well, trying to see where it continues here. Pages stuck together, you know how that goes. It might as well have been written after seeing the strange, desolate lands lying in western Dakota. All through the early part of the day we drifted swiftly down between the heaped-up piles of ice, the cakes and slabs now dirty and unattractive-looking. Towards evening, however, there came long reaches where the banks on either side were bare, though even here there would every now and then be necks where the jam had been crowded into too narrow a spot and had risen over the side as it had done upstream, grinding the bark from the big cottonwoods and snapping the smaller ones off short. In such places the ice walls were sometimes 8 or 10 feet high, continually undermined by the restless current, and every now and then overhanging pieces would break off and slide into the stream with a loud sullen splash, like the plunge of some great water beast. Nor did we fare to go in too close to the high cliffs, as boulders and earth masses, freed by the thaw from the grip of the frost, kept rolling and leaping down their faces and forced us to keep a sharp lookout lest our boat should be swamped. At nightfall we landed and made our camp on a point of wood-covered land jutting out into the stream. We had seen very little trace of life until late in the day, for the ducks had not yet arrived. But in the afternoon a sharp-tailed prairie fowl flew across the stream ahead of the boat, lighting on a low branch by the water's edge. Shooting him, we landed and picked off 2 others that were perched high up in leafless cottonwoods, plucking the buds. These 3 birds served us as supper, and shortly afterward, as the cold grew more and more biting, we rolled in under our furs and blankets and were soon asleep. In the morning it was evident that instead of thawing it had grown decidedly colder. The anchor ice was running thick in the river, and we spent the first hour or 2 after sunrise in hunting over the frozen swamp bottom for white-tailed deer, of which there were many tracks, but we saw nothing. Then we broke camp and again started downstream, a simple operation as we had no tent, and all we had to do was to cord up our bedding and gather the mess kit. It was colder than before, and for some time we went along in chilly silence, nor was it until midday that the sun warmed our blood in the least. The crooked bed of the river twisted hither and thither, but whichever way it went, the icy north wind, blowing stronger all the time, drew steadily up it. One of us remarking that it looked like we'd have it in our faces all day, the steersman announced that we couldn't unless it was the crookedest wind in Dakota, and half an hour afterwards we heard him muttering to himself that it was the crookedest wind in Dakota. We passed a group of teepees on one bottom, marking the deserted winter camp of some Grove Enter Indians, which some of my men had visited a few months previously on a trading expedition. It was almost the last point on the river with which we were acquainted. At midday we landed on a sandbar for lunch, a simple enough meal, the tea being boiled over a fire of driftwood that also fried the bacon, while the bread only needed to be baked every other day. Then we again shoved off. As the afternoon waned, the cold grew still more bitter, and the wind increased, blowing in fitful gusts against us, until it chilled us to the marrow when we sat still. But rarely did we sit still, for even the rapid current was unable to urge the light draft scow down in the teeth of the strong blasts, and we only got her along by dint of hard work with pole and paddle. Long before the sun went down, the ice had begun to freeze on the handles of the poles, and we were not sorry to haul on shore for the night. For supper we had again prairie fowl, having shot 4 from a great patch of bullberry bushes late in the afternoon. A man doing hard open-air work in cold weather is always hungry for meat. During the night the thermometer went down to 0, and in the morning the anchor ice was running so thickly that we did not care to start at once, for it is most difficult to handle a boat in the deep frozen slush. Accordingly we took a couple of hours for a deer hunt, as there were evidently many whitetail in the bottom. We selected one long, isolated patch of tangled trees and brushwood, 2 of us beating through it while the other watched one end. But almost before we'd begun, 4 deer broke out at one side, loped easily off, evidently not being much scared, and took refuge in a deep glen or gorge densely wooded with cedars that made a blind pocket in the steep side of one of the great plateaus bounding the bottom. After a short consultation, one of our number crept round to the head of the gorge, making a wide detour, and the other 2 advanced up it on each side, thus completely surrounding the deer. They attempted to break out past the man at the head of the glen, who shot down a couple, a buck and a yearling doe. The other 2 made their escape by running off over ground so rough that it looked fitter to be crossed by their upland-loving cousins, the black-tailed deer. This success gladdened our souls, ensuring us plenty of fresh meat. We carried pretty much all of both deer back to camp, and after a hearty breakfast, loaded our scow and started merrily off once more. The cold still continued intense, and as the day wore away, we became numbed by it, until at last an incident occurred that set our blood running freely again. We were, of course, always on the alert, keeping a sharp lookout ahead and around us and making as little noise as possible. Finally, our watchfulness was rewarded. From the middle of the afternoon of this, the 3rd day we had been gone, as we came around a bend, we saw in front of us the lost boat, together with a scow moored against the bank, while from among the bushes some little way back the smoke of a campfire curled up through the frosty air. We had come on the camp of the thieves. As I glanced at the faces of my 2 followers, I was struck by the grim, eager look in their eyes. Our overcoats were off in a second, and after exchanging a few muttered words, the boat was hastily and silently shoved toward the bank. As soon as it touched the shore ice, I leaped out and ran up behind a clump of bushes so as to cover the landing of the others, who had to make the boat fast. For a moment we felt a thrill of keen excitement, and our veins tingled as we crept cautiously towards the fire, for it seemed likely that there would be a brush. But as it turned out, this was almost the only moment of much interest, for the capture itself was as tame as possible. The men we were after knew they had taken with them the only craft there was on the river, and so felt perfectly secure. Accordingly, we took them absolutely by surprise. The only one in camp was the German, whose weapons were on the ground, and who, of course, gave up at once, his 2 companions being off hunting. We made him safe, delegating one of our number to look after him particularly, and see that he made no noise, and then sat down and waited for the others. The camp was under the lee of a cut bank, behind which we crouched, and after waiting an hour or more, the men we were after came in. We heard them a long way off, and made ready, watching them for some minutes as they walked toward us, their rifles on their shoulders, and the sunlight glinting on the steel barrels. When they were within 20 yards or so, we straightened up from behind the bank, covered them with our cocked rifles while I shouted to them to hold up their hands, an order that in such a case in the West a man is not apt to disregard if he thinks the giver is in earnest. The half-breed obeyed at once, his knees trembling as if they had been made of whalebone. Finnegan hesitated for a second, his eyes fairly wolfish, Then, as I walked up within a few paces, covering the center of his chest so as to avoid overshooting, and repeating the command, he saw that he had no show, and with an oath let his rifle drop and held his hands up beside his head. It was nearly dusk, so we camped where we were. The first thing to be done was to collect enough wood to enable us to keep a blazing fire all night long. While Seawall and Dow, thoroughly at home in the use of the axe, chopped down dead cottonwood trees and dragged the logs up into a huge pile, I kept guard over the 3 prisoners, who were huddled into a sullen group some 20 yards off, just the right distance for the buckshot in the double barrel. Having captured our men, we were in a quandary how to keep them. The cold was so intense that to tie them tightly hand and foot meant in all likelihood freezing both hands and feet off during the night, and it was no use tying them at all unless we tied them tightly enough to stop in part the circulation. So nothing was left for us to do but to keep perpetual guard over them. Of course, we had carefully searched them and taken away not only their firearms and knives, but everything else that could possibly be used as a weapon. By this time they were pretty well cowed, as they found out very quickly that they would be well treated so long as they remained quiet, but would receive some rough handling if they attempted any disturbance. Our next step was to cord their weapons up in some bedding, which we sat on while we took supper. Immediately afterward, we made the men take off their boots, an additional safeguard, as it was cactus country, in which a man could travel barefoot only at the risk of almost certainly laming himself for life, and go to bed, all 3 lying on one buffalo robe and being covered by another, in the full light of the blazing fire. We determined to watch in succession a half night each, thus each getting a full rest every 3rd night. I took first watch, my 2 companions, revolver under head, rolling up in their blankets on the side of the fire opposite that on which the captives lay, while I, in fur cap, gauntlets, and overcoat, took my station a little way back in the circle of firelight, in a position in which I could watch my men with the absolute certainty of being able to stop any movement, no matter how sudden. For this night watching, we always used the double barrel with buckshot, as a rifle is uncertain in the dark, while with a shotgun at such a distance, and with men lying down, a person who is watchful may be sure that they cannot get up, no matter how quick they are, without being riddled. The only danger lies in the extreme monotony of sitting still in the dark, guarding men who make no motion, and the consequent tendency to go to sleep, especially when one's had a hard day's work and is feeling really tired. But neither on the first night nor on any subsequent one did we ever abate a jot of our watchfulness. Next morning we started downstream, having a well-laden flotilla, for the men we had caught had a good deal of plunder in their boats, including some saddles, as they evidently intended to get horses as soon as they reached a part of the country where there were any, and where it was possible to travel. Finnegan, who was the ringleader and the man I was especially after, I kept by my side in our boat, the other 2 being put in their own scow, heavily laden and rather leaky, with only 1 paddle. We kept them in sight all the time we traveled. We soon ran into trouble. The current ran too fast to let us work back against it, and we could not pull the boat up over the steep banks of rotten ice, which were breaking off and falling in all the time. We could only land and snub the boats up with ropes, holding them there for 2 or 3 hours until the jam worked down once more. All the time, of course, having to keep guard over the captives, who had caused us so much trouble that we were bound to bring them in no matter what else we lost. We had to be additionally cautious on account of being in Indian country, having worked down past Killdeer Mountains, where some of my cowboys had run across a band of Sioux, said to be Teton Sioux, the year before. Very probably the Indians would not have harmed us anyhow, but as we were hampered by the prisoners, we preferred not meeting them, nor did we, though we saw plenty of fresh signs and found to our sorrow that they had just made a grand hunt all down the river and had killed or driven almost every head of passing game in the country through which we were traveling. As our stock of provisions grew scantier and scantier, we tried in vain to eke it out by the chase, for we saw no game. 2 of us would go out hunting at a time, while the 3rd kept guard over the prisoners. The prisoners would be made to sit down together on a blanket at one side of the fire, while the guard, for the time being, stood or sat some 15 or 20 yards off. The prisoners being unarmed and kept close together, there was no possibility of their escaping, and the guard kept at such a distance that they could not overpower him by springing on him, he having a Winchester or the double-barreled shotgun always in his hands, cocked and at the ready. So long as we kept wide awake and watchful, there was not the least danger, as our 3 men knew us and understood perfectly that the slightest attempt at a break would result in their being shot down. But although there was thus no risk, it was harassing, tedious work, and the strain, day in and day out, without any rest or let-up, became very tiresome. The days were monotonous to a degree. The endless rows of hills bounding the valley, barren and naked, stretched along it without a break. When we rounded a bend, it was only to see on each hand the same lines of broken buttes dwindling off into the distance ahead of us as they had dwindled off into the distance behind. If in hunting we climbed to their tops, as far as our eyes could scan, there was nothing but the great rolling prairie, bleak and lifeless, reaching off to the horizon. We broke camp in the morning on a point of land covered with brown, leafless, frozen cottonwoods, and in the afternoon we pitched camp on another point in the midst of a grove of the same stiff, dreary trees. The discolored river, whose eddies boiled into yellow foam, flowed always between the same banks of frozen mud or of muddy ice. And what was, from a practical standpoint, even worse, our diet began to be the same as the scenery. Being able to kill nothing, we exhausted all our stock of provisions and got reduced to flour without yeast or baking powder, and unleavened bread made with exceedingly muddy water is not, as a steady thing, attractive. Finding that they were well treated, and were also watched with the closest vigilance, our prisoners behaved themselves excellently and gave no trouble. Though afterward, when out of our hands and shut up in jail, the half-breed got into a stabbing affray. They conversed freely with my 2 men on a number of indifferent subjects, and after the first evening no allusion was made to the theft or anything connected with it, so that an outsider, overhearing the conversation, would never have guessed what our relations to each other really were. Once, and once only, did Finnegan broach the subject. Somebody had been speaking of a man whom we all knew, called Calamity, who had been recently taken by the sheriff on a charge of horse stealing. Calamity had escaped once, but was caught at a disadvantage the next time. Nevertheless, when summoned to hold his hands up, he refused and attempted to draw his own revolver, with the result of having 2 bullets put through him. Finnegan commented on Calamity as a fool for not knowing when a man had the drop on him, and then suddenly turning to me, his weather-beaten face flushing darkly, "If I'd had any show at all, you'd sure have had to fight, Mr. Roosevelt. But there wasn't any use making a break when I'd only have got shot myself with no chance of harming anyone else." I laughed and nodded, and the subject was dropped. Indeed, if the time was tedious to us, it must have seemed never-ending to our prisoners, who had nothing to do but lie still and read, or chew the bitter cud of their reflections, always conscious that some pair of eyes was watching them every moment, and that at least one loaded rifle was ever ready to be used against them. When finally we did reach the ranch, it was difficult to determine who was happier to be there, ourselves or our captives. And that wraps it up for today, little buddies. That was a very interesting and exciting story, wasn't it? People had to be tough to live in the West back in those days. So I will leave you with a reminder, if you haven't joined the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club yet, might be a good time to do so. Download 2 great audiobooks like I've been reading out of today for only $10, and have access to Out and About with Uncle Rick, Fun Learning with Uncle Rick, and Uncle Rick's Bible Lessons. So, until we meet again, put God first in your life, be a patriotic American, and honor your father and mother. So long.
Parents, if your kids enjoyed their visit with Uncle Rick, know that they will love the Uncle Rick Audiobook Club. The Uncle Rick Audiobook Club allows access to dozens more stories, both from history and the Bible, to help your kids learn about godly character. Here's what one parent had to say about the book club. "My children love the stories. They make history so interesting. My son says it is because of the details that most textbooks don't include. Uncle Rick is easy to listen to. We love his accents and explanations." Thank you so much for that testimony. If you'd like to learn more about the Uncle Rick Book Club, Please join us over at UncleRickAudios.com. That is UncleRickAudios.com. See you there.